The ranch in the storm. The man who saved a life without knowing fate's price. John had always known the ranch. It wasn't just a piece of land, it was his life. The sprawling acres, the old barn creaking in the wind, the scent of hay and earth beneath his boots, everything about this place was part of him. He woke up before dawn each day, the cold air sharp against his skin as he trudged out into the quiet morning. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the world around him was still wrapped in darkness. Yet, there was no better feeling than stepping out into the vast emptiness of the land, knowing the day ahead would be filled with hard work and routine. The ranch had been passed down through generations. His father had worked it before him, his grandfather before that. The cattle were always the same, stubborn, independent creatures with minds of their own. The fences, too, needed constant attention, and the barn was forever in need of repairs. Every day, John spent hours fixing, mending, and tending to the needs of the land. It was a quiet life, one that didn't demand much from him except his labor. He didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it this way. The silence of the countryside, the absence of distractions, this was how he liked to live. It was a life of simplicity, of routine. By midday, John would take a break, sitting on the porch of his small, weather-worn house, looking out across the fields. The wind would stir the tall grass, and he'd watch the cattle graze lazily in the distance. There was peace in this moment, a stillness that washed over him as he drank from his thermos and wiped the sweat from his brow. The simplicity of it all made him feel at ease. He had no need for friends or company. The land was enough for him. He often thought that if he'd had to explain his life to someone else, he would have said it was quiet, steady, and unchanging. The town was a 20-minute drive away. John didn't go there often. There wasn't much in the small, dusty town that appealed to him. The local store, a couple of diners, a gas station, these were all he ever needed when he made his rare trips to town for supplies. The people there knew him, of course. They knew the man who ran the ranch on the edge of the hill, the one who worked in silence, kept to himself, and never stayed for long. Sometimes they'd wave, but most often John simply passed by, his truck kicking up dust in the rearview mirror. On Sundays, there was church. John wasn't a deeply religious man, but he went every week without fail. It wasn't the sermons that drew him there, but the sense of tradition. His mother had taken him to church when he was a boy, and even now, it felt like the right thing to do. Afterward, he'd return to the ranch, the echo of the preacher's words still lingering in his mind, but it would fade soon enough. The land was what called to him. The cows and the crops needed tending, and the hours would pass quickly as he worked, one task after another, always in motion. But as much as John liked his solitude, there were moments when he felt the weight of it. It wasn't that he was lonely exactly. It was more like an old, familiar ache that came in quiet waves, a restlessness that occasionally washed over him when the work was done, and the day began to close. He'd sit on the porch at dusk, watching the stars appear one by one, and for a brief moment he'd wonder if there was more to life than this. But the thought never lingered long. The ranch was his world. It had always been this way, and he had no reason to think it would ever change. Over the years, there had been a few women who had passed through John's life, though none had stayed. The ones who visited, whether for a brief affair or an attempt at something more, always left. They couldn't handle the isolation, the grueling labor, the silence that stretched between them like an endless desert. John had never really minded. He knew what he wanted from life, and it wasn't companionship or romance. He didn't need someone else to feel complete. The ranch was enough. It wasn't that he was cold or unfeeling. It was just that he had learned early on that people, like the seasons, came and went. The land, however, stayed constant. It didn't ask for anything except your sweat and effort in return. It was a good deal, really. And so he worked. He worked without complaint, without expectation. The work was never done, and that was fine. Every day brought something new, an issue with the fence, a cow that needed doctoring, a storm brewing on the horizon. There was always something that needed fixing, and John was always there to fix it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft shade of purple, John looked out across the fields. The wind was picking up, rustling the branches of the trees that lined the perimeter of his property. He could feel the change in the air, a shift that came before every storm. The clouds gathered on the horizon, heavy and dark, rolling in like a great beast. John didn't worry. He'd been through storms before. He knew the land, knew the signs. There was no need to be afraid. The ranch had weathered countless storms over the years, and it would survive this one too. It always did. But as John went about his evening chores, there was something different in the air that he couldn't shake. A sense of foreboding, though he couldn't explain why. He dismissed it, as he always did. The storm would pass like they all did. And when it was over, he would be here on the ranch, alone as usual. Little did he know, this storm was about to change everything. The storm arrived as silently as it had threatened, building over the course of the evening until it became a beast, crashing upon the land with a fury that John could never have anticipated. As nightfall descended, the air grew thick with moisture, heavy and thick, almost suffocating. The first signs of trouble were subtle, just a soft rumble in the distance, a faint whisper of wind through the trees. But John had been around long enough to recognize the warning signs. The sky had darkened earlier than usual, and the breeze that had stirred the tall grass now seemed more like a warning than a comfort. By the time John had finished his evening chores, the first drops of rain began to fall. It wasn't much at first, just a light drizzle, but the air felt different, thick, oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. John stood for a moment on the porch, looking up at the swirling clouds above. His instincts told him this wouldn't be a simple rainstorm. He had seen them before, the kind that came and went quickly, but this felt different. There was a sense of dread that tugged at his gut. He moved quickly to secure the barn doors and check on the animals. The cows had already begun to huddle together near the shelter, their bodies pressed close for warmth and comfort. John walked through the barn, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He checked the roof, the windows, making sure everything was in place. He'd done this countless times before, but tonight something felt off. The wind had picked up in intensity, pushing against the barn as if it wanted to tear it apart. "Just a storm," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so uneasy before a storm. But this was his life. Storms came and storms passed. He had no reason to think this one would be different. By the time he finished his checks, the rain was pouring in sheets, the sound of it hammering against the roof like 1,000 drummers playing in unison. The wind howled, and the trees in the distance began to bend under its force, their limbs swaying dangerously. The barn creaked under the pressure, the walls groaning as if they might give way. John moved inside, closing the heavy wooden doors and huddling by the small wood stove in the corner, hoping the warmth would settle his nerves. It wasn't long before the storm began to show its true power. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the barn, rattling the walls with such force that John could feel the ground tremble beneath him. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, flooding the fields in a matter of hours. John looked out the window and saw the creek near the edge of the property begin to swell. It wasn't the first time he had seen the creek rise after a heavy rain, but this time the water seemed to move faster, pushing against the banks as though it had a mind of its own. As the night wore on, the storm grew fiercer, relentless in its assault on the ranch. John sat near the fire, his mind wandering, but always returning to the land outside. He had lived through many storms in his life, but something about this one felt different, as if the storm itself had a purpose beyond just the weather. He had seen trees uprooted before, fences torn apart, but never had he felt so small, so insignificant in the face of nature's power. Then, in the midst of the storm, as the wind howled and the rain slammed against the windows, John thought he heard something. A sound, faint at first, carried on the wind. It wasn't the usual howl of the storm or the creak of the trees bending in the wind. It was a cry, distant and desperate, as if someone was calling for help. John froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment the world outside seemed to fall away. The cry came again, clearer this time, a sound filled with panic and fear. John's mind raced. He wasn't sure what he had heard, but it was unmistakable. Someone needed help. He knew the area around the ranch well. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and it wasn't likely anyone would be out in this storm. He grabbed his coat, throwing it over his shoulders, and ran for the door. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as soon as he stepped outside. The rain hit his face like cold needles, and the world was a blur of water and wind. John squinted through the dark, trying to make sense of the swirling chaos around him. The cry had come from somewhere to the west, beyond the farthest fields, near the old creek bed. Without thinking, he began running toward the sound, pushing through the rain and the mud, his boots slipping on the wet earth beneath him. The world around him was deafening. The storm screamed in his ears and the trees groaned under the force of the wind. But John didn't stop. He kept moving, his legs burning from the effort, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who, or what, he was running toward, but the desperation in that cry was enough to drive him forward. The closer he got to the creek, the louder the sound became. It wasn't just a cry anymore. It was a plea for help, a voice struggling to be heard above the storm. John's heart raced. What if someone was trapped? What if someone was in danger, stranded in the floodwaters or caught beneath the debris? The thought pushed him to run faster, despite the wind pushing against him with all its might. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running through the storm, John reached the creek. The water was rising rapidly, rushing past with the force of a torrent. He could barely see through the sheets of rain, but there in the darkness he saw movement. A figure, a woman it seemed, was struggling in the water, her arms flailing as she tried to keep her head above the rising flood. The creek had swollen so quickly that it had nearly overtaken the land around it. The woman's feet were tangled in branches, and the water was pulling her under. Without a second thought, John dashed forward, his hands outstretched. He reached her just in time, grabbing hold of her wrist with a strength that surprised him. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The floodwaters were rising faster than he had expected, and the cold of the water made his skin burn. "Hold on," John shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The woman's grip was weak, but she held on tightly as John pulled with everything he had. The current was fierce, trying to drag them both into the water, but John refused to let go. His feet slipped in the mud, and he nearly lost his balance, but somehow he managed to drag her to safety, away from the rising floodwaters. Once they were on solid ground, John collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily. The woman, now safe, was still trembling, her face pale with shock. She looked up at him with wide eyes, but her lips didn't move. She was too shaken to speak. John stood up slowly, his body aching from the effort. He knew the storm wasn't over. The woman needed shelter, and there was no time to waste. With one last glance at the rushing creek, John helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back toward the ranch. By the time John and the woman reached the ranch, the storm had only grown fiercer. The wind howled in the trees, and the rain seemed to come down in sheets, relentlessly pounding the ground. John guided her toward the small house, his hand steady on her arm as they walked quickly through the muddy yard. The woman's steps were slow, her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold and shock. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she looked around, still dazed by the ordeal. "Come on," John said, his voice firm but gentle. He guided her up the porch steps and opened the door to the house. The warmth of the fire inside was a welcome relief after the biting cold of the storm. John quickly closed the door behind them and locked it, his mind still racing with the events of the past few minutes. He looked at the woman, taking in her bedraggled appearance. Her hair was wet and tangled, and her clothes clung to her thin frame, soaked through. Despite the storm's fury outside, she was eerily quiet. She hadn't said a word since he'd pulled her from the water, and John wasn't sure if she was still in shock or simply too exhausted to speak. But her silence only made the situation feel more surreal. A woman stranded in the storm, pulled from the creek. She was a stranger, and yet John had risked everything to save her. "Are you all right?" John asked, his voice soft but urgent. He didn't know what else to say. The shock was still settling in, both for him and for her. The woman just nodded faintly, her eyes distant, staring out the window where the rain blurred the world beyond. John stepped toward the fireplace, where the crackling flames cast a warm glow over the small room. He grabbed an old blanket from the couch and handed it to her. "Here," he said, his hand slightly shaking as he tried to offer some comfort. She accepted it with a quiet thanks but still didn't speak. John watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should he ask her who she was, where she came from? What had she been doing out in the storm, so far from anywhere? But something told him that now wasn't the time for questions. She needed warmth, rest, and maybe a bit of quiet after everything that had happened. John moved to the kitchen and began to make some tea, the warm steam rising from the cup as he carried it over to her. He handed it to her gently, and this time she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he'd saved her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. John nodded, his heart softening at the sound of her voice. "It's nothing. You're safe now. Just try to get some rest." She took the tea from him, her hands shaking slightly as she brought the cup to her lips. John sat down across from her, his eyes studying her quietly. She was young, he thought, probably no older than 25 or so. Her face was pale and her eyes, though tired, were sharp, almost searching. There was something about her, something that didn't quite fit with the quiet life he led on the ranch. He wondered why she had been out there, alone in the storm, but he didn't ask, not yet. Instead, he focused on making sure she was comfortable, making sure she had everything she needed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than he could understand. But for now, all that mattered was that she was safe. The storm raged on outside, but inside the house, the warmth of the fire and the simple comforts of the ranch surrounded them. Hours passed as the storm continued its fury outside. The woman finally seemed to settle, her body relaxing as she wrapped the blanket tightly around her. She didn't sleep immediately, but her eyes closed, and her breathing slowed, as though she was trying to find some sense of peace amidst the chaos. John, for his part, kept to himself. He didn't want to press her with questions, not yet. He'd given her a place to rest, and for the moment that was enough. As the hours passed and the storm's roar began to die down, John found himself standing by the window, looking out into the rain. The creek had swollen almost to its banks, and the ground was saturated, muddy and slick. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, the realization of what he had just done sinking in. He had saved a life tonight, but he had no idea who this woman was or where she had come from. It didn't matter in that moment, but it would, eventually. The questions would come. He turned back to look at her, still sitting quietly in the corner of the room, her eyes closed. He was grateful that she was safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary rescue. The way she had been stranded so far from the ranch, her near drowning in the creek, it all seemed too strange, too unlikely. But that was the way life worked sometimes. Things happened for reasons we didn't always understand, and sometimes there was nothing to do but ride the wave and see where it took us. After a few more hours, the storm had finally passed. The rain had stopped, and the wind had calmed, though the night was still thick with the dampness of the storm. John stood up from his chair and made his way to the door, stepping out onto the porch to survey the damage. The ranch had weathered the storm as it always did, but the floodwaters had made a mess of the fields. It would take time to clean up, to repair the damage. But that could wait. For now, there was something else on his mind. He turned back to the house and entered, his footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. The woman was still there, still sitting by the fire, though her eyes were open now, and she seemed more alert. She met his gaze with a faint smile, but there was something in her eyes that John couldn't place. It was as if she was hiding something, something more than just the exhaustion of nearly drowning. "Feeling better?" John asked, his voice warm but cautious. He had helped her, and now he wanted to make sure she was okay. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind that there was more to this story. She nodded, her smile fading slightly. "Yes, thank you, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," John replied. "Just get some rest. You're safe here." And for the first time, she looked at him with something other than exhaustion in her eyes. There was a flicker of gratitude there, but also something else, something deeper, something John couldn't quite grasp. The night stretched on, quiet now, the only sounds the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder fading away in the distance. John stood near the fire, keeping watch as the woman finally drifted into a restless sleep, the weight of the night's events hanging in the air. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had led her to the ranch in the middle of a storm, John knew this wasn't the end of their story. Morning came slowly, the first light of day creeping through the curtains like a soft breath. John woke up early as usual, even though the storm had passed and the ranch was still, for now, safe. The ground outside was still damp, the air thick with the lingering scent of rain, but the worst of the weather seemed to be over. He stepped outside onto the porch, the cool morning air brushing against his face as he took in the peaceful scene before him. The fields were wet, the sky was cloudy but clearing, and the trees swayed gently in the light breeze. The calm after the storm was always a welcome sight, even though it didn't erase the heavy thoughts on his mind. The woman, still asleep inside, had been resting through the night without speaking much. John had tried to keep his distance, not wanting to overwhelm her. She had been through something traumatic, something he couldn't fully understand. But there was an undeniable pull, a curiosity about her that kept him awake. Who was she? Why had she been out there in the storm, alone and seemingly lost? And why hadn't she told him anything about herself when he'd brought her in from the creek? John didn't want to press her for answers. Not yet. But something told him that her silence wasn't just from shock. It was as if she was hiding something, something important. He went back inside, his boots creaking on the wooden floors as he moved toward the kitchen. The woman was still asleep in the chair by the fire, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her breathing was steady now, but her face was still pale, her brow furrowed slightly even in her sleep. John hesitated for a moment, watching her. He had saved her life, had brought her in from the storm, sheltered her, given her warmth. And yet he didn't fully understand what had brought her here. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. John's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been expecting anyone, especially not so early in the morning. He moved cautiously toward the door, his mind racing. Had someone come looking for the woman? Did they know she was here? John wasn't sure if he was ready to deal with whatever might come next, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Whoever it was had to be dealt with. He opened the door slowly, his hand resting on the handle. On the other side stood a tall man, dressed in dark clothes with a look that was both serious and calm. His face was hard, his eyes sharp and calculating. He was someone who had clearly seen things in life, someone who wasn't easily impressed or rattled. John didn't recognize him, and that alone made his stomach tighten. The man's presence didn't feel like the casual visit of a neighbor. There was something more to it. "Morning," the man said, his voice low and steady. I'm looking for someone, a woman. She came through here last night, caught in the storm. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He hadn't said anything to anyone about the woman, but somehow this stranger knew. "What's this about?" John asked, his tone guarded. The man studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She's in trouble, and I need to find her. You don't need to know everything, but I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to make sure she's all right." John's mind was racing. Who was this man? And what kind of trouble was he talking about? He thought of the woman inside, still asleep, vulnerable. John's protective instincts kicked in. He had already risked his life to save her, and now someone else was looking for her, someone who wasn't offering much in the way of explanation. "She's here," John said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "She's resting. She's been through a lot." The man nodded, his expression softening just a bit. "I understand, but she's been mixed up in something serious. There are people looking for her, and if she stays here too long, she might bring that trouble to your doorstep." John didn't like the sound of that. The idea of trouble finding its way to his ranch, his quiet, simple life, was more than he could bear. He had never wanted anything more than peace, but now this stranger was hinting at something darker, something that threatened to shatter the calm he had built for years. "You're saying she's in danger?" John asked, trying to keep his voice even, trying not to let his growing unease show. The man nodded. "More than you know. She's involved with people who don't take kindly to being crossed. And now that you've helped her, you might find yourself in their sights too." John's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of people are we talking about?" The stranger didn't answer right away. He glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was nearby, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "The kind that get what they want, no matter the cost. The kind that won't hesitate to take someone down if it means protecting their own interests." John felt a cold chill settle in his chest. The woman, whoever she was, had been involved with dangerous people. He had no idea how deep this went or what kind of trouble he had brought upon himself by helping her. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't just send her away. Not after everything she had been through, and certainly not without understanding more about what was really going on. "I'm not just going to turn her away," John said, his voice steady but firm. "She's safe here. And I'm not going to let anyone threaten her or me, for that matter." The stranger studied him for a long moment. It was clear that he was weighing John's words, deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he nodded, as if coming to some decision. "All right. But just remember, you're involved now. If you decide to keep her here, there's no going back. You'll be in their sights as much as she is." John's thoughts raced. He had already made his choice, but the gravity of what was happening was starting to hit him. The woman he had saved was more than just a lost soul caught in a storm. She was running from something dangerous, and by helping her, he had become part of that world. The price of saving her life was much higher than he had anticipated. The man turned to leave but paused before walking away. "I'll be back," he said, "and if you change your mind, let me know." John watched him walk away, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He closed the door quietly, leaning his back against it as he exhaled a long breath. What had he gotten himself into? Was it worth the risk? The peaceful life he had known for so long was suddenly uncertain, upended by the presence of one woman, and the danger that seemed to follow her wherever she went. He turned toward the kitchen, where the woman was still resting. He didn't know if she had heard the conversation, but somehow he knew that whatever had brought her to his ranch, it was far from over. The storm might have passed, but the true tempest was just beginning. John moved toward her, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He needed to talk to her. He needed answers. But the feeling in his gut told him that the truth was more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from, it was now part of his life too, and there was no turning back. The days following the stranger's visit passed in a strange blur. John went about his usual routine on the ranch, but his mind was constantly preoccupied with the woman, the one he had saved from the storm. Every time he thought of her, his heart tightened with a mixture of concern, guilt, and something else he couldn't quite define. What was the real story behind her? Who were the people chasing her? And why had they come all the way out here to this quiet, secluded ranch? He had saved her life, but had he made a terrible mistake by bringing her here? The storm had passed, but the world outside still felt unsettled. John couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking just beyond the horizon, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the weight of the situation hung heavily on his shoulders. The ranch had always been his sanctuary, his place of peace. Now it felt like a target caught in a storm of its own. As days turned into weeks, the woman Sarah, he had finally learned her name, grew stronger. She still wasn't fully recovered, physically or emotionally, but she seemed to settle into the routine of the ranch, her silences becoming less frequent, her presence more familiar. She would help with small tasks, feeding the animals, collecting firewood, and though she never asked for anything, it was clear she was trying to make herself useful. But there was always that lingering sense of something unspoken between them. Sarah still hadn't told him what had really happened, why she had been out in that storm, or why she was being hunted by dangerous people. It was as if the weight of her secrets was too much to bear. John tried not to press her. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but his mind often wandered back to that night, the night she had been trapped in the creek. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling as he pulled her from the water. It was as if she was haunted by something much deeper than just the physical trauma of the storm. Whatever it was, it had changed her, and John could sense it. But he didn't ask. He couldn't. It wasn't until the fourth week after the storm that things truly began to unravel. It started with the small things: a car passing by the ranch at odd hours of the night, the rustle of footsteps in the trees beyond the property line, the feeling that someone was watching. At first, John thought it was just his imagination, but over time, the signs became harder to ignore. It wasn't just coincidence. People were coming closer, drawing nearer to the ranch. And every time John looked out across the fields, there was a sense that he was being watched. A cold feeling would settle over him, a gnawing certainty that danger was no longer something far off, something that could be dismissed. It was here, right at his doorstep. One evening after dark, when the wind had died down and the air was still, John heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual rumble of a neighbor's truck. This was different, too slow, too deliberate. He moved to the window, peering out into the dark. The headlights cut through the night, bright against the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. The car was heading toward his ranch. John's stomach tightened. He moved quietly toward the door, glancing over at Sarah, who was sitting by the fire. She had her head down, staring into the flames as though lost in thought. He didn't want to worry her, but he also couldn't ignore what was happening. He had to be prepared. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way to the front of the house. The car had stopped by the gate, and John could just make out the silhouette of a figure stepping out from behind the headlights. It wasn't the stranger from before, but the man's face was eerily familiar. A sharp look, eyes that seemed to see everything, and a calmness that unnerved John. The man walked toward him slowly, his boots making no sound on the ground. John stood his ground, trying to mask the unease that was building in his chest. "Can I help you?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past John, glancing briefly at the house before turning his attention back to him. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "A woman. She's been here, hasn't she?" John felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't show it. He stepped forward slightly, blocking the man's view of the house. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said firmly. "There's no one here." The man's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe you," he said softly. "I know she's here, we know she's here, and we need her back." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. It was one thing to be told there were dangerous people looking for Sarah, but it was another to hear it from someone standing right in front of him. The man wasn't here to ask for help. He was here to take her. And John knew that if he didn't act quickly, he would lose everything: the ranch, the quiet life he had built, and possibly even his own life. He didn't think. He just reacted. Without warning, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the man's collar. But before he could make contact, the man shifted, effortlessly slipping out of his grasp. "You're making a mistake," the man said, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You don't know what you're dealing with." John's heart raced, but his resolve hardened. "I'm not letting you take her," he said, his voice low and steady. For a moment the man said nothing. Then he gave a slight nod as though considering John's words. "You think you can protect her. You think you can keep her safe from us." His voice grew colder, harder. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with. We've been watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake." John's fists clenched. The man's words weren't just a threat, they were a warning. He knew now that he was in way deeper than he had ever intended. Whatever this was, whatever danger Sarah had brought with her, it was not something he could just run from. The moment he had pulled her from the creek, his life had changed forever. "I'm not afraid of you," John said, his voice firm. The man chuckled darkly. "You will be. Everyone is." Before John could react, the man turned and walked back to his car, his movements deliberate. The headlights flashed one last time as the car pulled away, the engine roaring into the night. John stood there for a long moment, his mind reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, Sarah had heard the exchange. She was standing at the door now, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "John, who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. John didn't know how to answer. All he could do was walk toward her, his hand on her shoulder. "We're not safe here anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to bring this to you, but now they won't stop until they get what they want." John swallowed hard. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. He had saved her life, but now it seemed like the cost was far higher than he could have imagined.